Town and the NRF Saatchi Chair in Security and Justice. The recording was part of a series of seminars entitled #Thought Leader Encounter, featuring leading and emerging academics on law and society in Africa. If you would like to find out more about the work of the Center, please check out our website at www.cls.uct.ac.za or follow us on Facebook at CLSUCT or Twitter at CLSUCT. Happy listening.
My name is Dee Smythe, and I wanted to welcome you all. We are hosting a series of lunchtime seminars in partnership with the Center for Law and Society that are kind of raising critical issues in socio-legal studies and in law and society. It forms part of a larger program centered around our master's course on law and society in Africa. And so I want to take a moment before I introduce our speaker to acknowledge and appreciate the other lecturers who are in the room and who've made themselves available for this very intensive course, which is happening over a period of 9 days. So Nochuto Tipe is in the room over there. Mrs. Saneli Sibanda from Wits University. Tara Weinberg has joined us. Nyasha Karimakwenda, Gloria Chakonda, Wami Kolawali, Jane Diala, Chris Kendall, I'm not sure if he's here, Tabitha Masengu, Tracy Gattuso from our own faculty, and Jamila Omar. I hope I haven't left anyone out. Marlies van Bromsen, yes, thank you, at the back there. And next week we'll continue, and you've seen some CLS posters that are having been put up. We have some wonderful people who will be arriving next week. Our speaker today needs no introduction, really, as a public intellectual. Joel Modiri is one of the most exciting legal theorists, one of the most generative legal theorists working in the South African Academy today. And I want to encourage you, after this lecture, to also go and read his work, and to read the work of the other people that I mentioned today, to engage with African scholarship on law and with the work of African scholars. And on that note, I am going to hand you over to Joel, who's already just done an hour of teaching. So he also is probably one of the lecturers with the most stamina in South African law today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making so much of your time available to us.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon. The people at the back can hear me. I'll try and keep my voice at that level, although I will be reading, so sometimes if I bow my head, just wave, not in a wild way, but just sort of lightly, then I'll know to raise my voice. Okay, so when I prepared for this talk, I understood that I would really be speaking to master students, people doing research and interested in sort of a deep elaboration of some problems. So I've prepared an actual talk, because I thought this would be a kind of master class where I would really just weigh people down with concepts and English. That is still what I'm going to do. But really, two things are important before I start. Really, to first say that these ideas for me as well are somewhat embryonic. I've come some way in working on them. But these are problems I've been working on, and problems that have been working on me. So I'm less interested at this moment in some of the answers and conclusions that I have reached or that I'm speculating on. I'm more interested in holding on to some of the problems that I'm going to give you as problems of thought or problems for thought. And the reason is because what I'm trying to set out here is really an agenda for theory building, an agenda for rethinking knowledge in the South African Academy. And that agenda turns on the question of South Africa, as you will see shortly. So this paper is sort of split up bits and pieces in 4 parts. Each part has a small title. They differ in length. Most of it will be reading our I'll break from script here and there, but it will be reading. I'll try to be done very soon, but let's get to it. Steve Biko, Critical Race Theory and Post-1994 South African Jurisprudence, Part 1. Part 1, The Time of Black Critique. The animating presumption of this paper is that the continuing material and psychic unfreedom of black people remains the central political and intellectual problem of black radical thought and practice in South Africa and beyond. This is to say that a key impulse of black radical critique inside and outside of the academy has to involve an attention to the repetition, the durability, the persistence of coloniality and white supremacy across the longue durée of social, political, economic, cultural, and psychic life. Such an attention would in the first place dissolve the often taken for granted boundary or distinction between past and present, old and new, then and now, in a way that would fracture dominant and common sense assumptions about time, about memory, about history, transition, liberation, and social change. In the South African context, I would argue that such a project would principally involve three things. One, a problematization of the notion of our society as post-apartheid, a critical opposition towards post-1994 constitutional democracy, and thirdly, a decentering, not rejecting or repudiating, but a decentering of the narrative of democratic transition that is rooted in the mythology of the Congress or Charterist tradition of the ANC. In my own research, I've been attempting to perform these three moves through a return to the archive of the Africanist or Azanian tradition, which begins properly with the anti-colonial wars of resistance, but is most clearly expressed in the mid-20th century in the political thought and activism of, among others, the ANC Youth League of the 1940s, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and the Black Consciousness Movement. But this return to the archive of older traditions of anti-colonial and black radical thought raises the challenge that's been introduced by David Scott through the concept, or through his concept of problem space. David Scott argued in Conscripts of Modernity that the problem space, the context as it were, that defined the anti-colonial period is not the same as ours. That the questions and predicaments of that time are no longer ours to answer, he says. What we need, says Scott, are decidedly new questions and new approaches to the problem of colonial and racial histories. Now, this is an inelegant summary of a complex argument, but what is clear for me is that problem space in David Scott's work is a temporal notion. It relates to our location in time. And much of his position would be incoherent without a certain intuition of periodization. In this regard, Scott's position has an uneasy relationship with another insight of the black radical tradition, which is that the foundations of the racial order are constitutive of and continuing into the present. I want to suggest that colonial conquest, slavery, and apartheid refuse periodization. The questions and problems which earlier generations of anti-colonial and black radical leaders grappled with remain pertinent, contra Scott, for as long as the conditions and the realities which engendered the revolutionary struggle remain in historical motion. Part 1, or rather part 2, the whiteness of the academy, or the whiteness of the legal academy. Yet we cannot commence with this project of black radical critique without reckoning with and transforming the particular dynamics in the South African academy that have historically marginalized black people and black thought. In his 1998 inaugural lecture entitled, "When Does a Settler Become a Native?", Mahmoud Mamdani argued that the Manichaean divide between settler and native, established through colonial conquest, was not only political, legal, and social, but he says it was intellectual as well. As he comments further on the South African Academy, he says, what is called African studies was in reality a study of natives by settler intellectuals. And these settler intellectuals, says Mamdani, comprised of both men and women. And they were also not simply right-wing or conservative, but also included white liberal and left academics. According to Mamdani, these settler intellectuals shared a common horizon defined by racial power and privilege. So he writes that even when they empathized with the native, they believed the native to be incapable of self-consciousness. Whereas earlier, more conservative traditions of scholarship viewed the native as a product of a disadvantaged biology, the more progressive left and liberal traditions viewed the native as a product of a disadvantaged history. Reading Mamdani in 2018 is a reminder that the university and knowledge production themselves are sides of the historical antagonism. It also brings to stark revelation the problem of the whiteness of the South African Academy. That is, to the fact that knowledge production and intellectual scientific practices across the disciplines, including law and jurisprudence, remain numerically, logically, and methodologically led and structured by whites in general. It is by now an open secret that the academic study and knowledge in areas such as equality, land, constitutionalism, memory, transitional justice, human rights, and the historical and philosophical study of society and critical theory is characterized by overwhelming white hegemony. This white epistemic authority works to define the intellectual problems of our time and set the agenda, that is, to construct the reality largely on the basis of Western paradigms that privilege socially white accounts of the world. The most pernicious effect of this white epistemic authority in the South African university has been what I would call the systematic social and cultural miseducation of particularly African students. The anomalous overrepresentation of white academics in a black majority African society is not merely a demographic problem of overrepresentativity, though it would be bad enough, but it's a conceptual one. It both indexes and obscures the fact of continuing racial unfreedom that defines South Africa's incomplete transition and unfinished business. Through leadership of academic departments and course coordination, academic seniority and decision-making power in matters of appointment and promotion, teaching and postgraduate supervision, conference organizing and international collaborations, journal editing and peer review, as well as citation practices, white academics repeatedly reproduce the centrality of their own perspectives. They police the boundaries of the disciplines, and they wield the power to validate or invalidate the methods, assumptions, and problems that circulate the field. Predictably, this has placed many black academics and postgraduates in the difficult position of having to reproduce, mimic, and parrot white scholarship and work within the accepted paradigms and canons in order to gain academic recognition and really sometimes just to get a job. In this regard, this is a manifestation of epistemic racism and white supremacy in the area of knowledge production, and it poses problems for the legibility and development of an emerging black critique. And this is because my own presumption is that a jurisprudence or any discipline that emanates from the imagination and the experience of the indigenous conquered and colonized peoples that have been historically racialized as black, and which takes seriously the intellectual heritages of African peoples, would pose at least somewhat different questions and enact a different orientation towards South African law, society, and politics that is presently the case in an academy that is dominated by conservative, liberal, and even critical traditions shaped by the epistemic standpoint of the conqueror. A black radical critique of post-1994 South Africa enters, nonetheless, inhospitable ground because it introduces a way of speaking and thinking about race and history that returns all of us to the scene of the crime, the site of the interminable, irreparable, and unforgivable historical antagonism, and thus it produces for all of us existential discomfort. Part 3, Shades of an Azanian Critique. The overall project of my research, I guess, has been to try and stage a theoretical encounter between the intellectual tradition of black radicalism in South Africa, or if you like, Africa South, and the jurisprudential project of critical race theory, particularly critical race theory's oppositional orientation and its concern with the endurance of racism and white supremacy in legal contexts that describe themselves as non-racial. But my real intention is to respond to the problem that the jurisprudential and political imaginary of South Africa our conceptions of equality and race, our ideas about social, political, and cultural ordering are derived almost exclusively, too hegemonically, from the Charterist or Congress tradition of the ANC, which, as we now know more clearly, historically unfolded in an antagonistic relationship to black radical politics. The history of the ANC is of a consistent expulsion of its radical children. So there's been an antinomy, I would say, between the Congress or Charterist traditions and the Africanist traditions for a long time. But as we all know, this antinomy became starkly clear from the 1955 adoption of the Freedom Charter, which we also know was contested for two reasons. One, the Freedom Charter is said to have propagated the untenable declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Because the black and white bit is slightly unnecessary, because you say all. But it propagated the untenable declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, obfuscating the historical fact of land dispossession and settler colonial white supremacy, but more problematically, concealing the reality that even at that time and now, it still belongs to those who conquered it. Secondly, the Freedom Charter and the intellectual milieu from which it emerged formulated justice in a political and philosophical language that was hostile to the black radical tradition. Formulated justice in terms that would ultimately play a key role in producing forms of knowledge and desire that displaced race as the central analytic and political contradiction of South Africa, and would come to privilege Western epistemes, Marxism and liberalism, under the banner of white progressive politics. So my project aims to map and overturn the process by which anti-colonial and black radical politics was replaced by multiracial liberalism. And I want to do this by recovering, even curating, the Azanian tradition and the modes of theoretical critique and political rage that are represented by the Azanian tradition, with a view to developing a critique of the post-1994 legal order. Now, the provenance of the term Azania is a long and protean one, but for our purposes, we know that Azania served as a political and philosophical signifier introduced by the Pan-Africanist Congress and then later adopted by the Black Consciousness Movement. It was a signifier for the liberated name of the territory that is currently mapped as South Africa. It is a key term in the lexicon of the Africanist black radical tradition because it reflects the view of South Africa as an artifact of colonial sovereignty that came into being in 1910 through the racial contract between the two European conquering powers that had subjugated the indigenous African population and other oppressed groups and racialized them as blacks in the process of inventing the political category of whiteness. Azania, therefore, marks the repudiation of the settler colonial foundations of South Africa, and it beckons what we could call a post-conquest rather than merely post-apartheid South Africa. In historical terms, then, Azania is a placeholder for a long-standing emancipatory and abolitionist horizon, first articulated by Africans in the waging of the wars of resistance against colonial rule. My own project extrapolates from this Azanian archive the resources for an alternative theory or an alternative jurisprudence, or at least a critique of the present jurisprudence in South Africa. Now, my talk will focus on the founder, the leader, and the chief theoretician of the Black Consciousness Movement, Stephen Bantu Biko, and what I want to offer here as his prophetic critique, and the prophetic is very important here, as his prophetic critique of post-apartheid law, a post-apartheid law which in many circles has for far too long been the object of uncritical celebration. So my contention is really twofold. The most simple or basic claim is that Biko's critique sets out suggestive lines of inquiry in the development of a critical race theory for a post-1994 South Africa. That's the basic claim. The more provocative claim, if you will, is that the jurisprudence of Steve Biko and its promise of an Azanian post-conquest world can only emerge on the ruins of the post-apartheid constitution. Part 4, Biko's prophecy. From his own time and space, Biko prophetically announces his opposition to post-apartheid law, constitutionalism and jurisprudence by asserting what we might call a contending historical and social interpretation of the South African colonial reality, and thereafter setting out an alternative vision for liberation, reconstruction, and reharmonization to the one that ultimately determined the terms of the transition to the new South Africa. We could say that the failure to heed Biko's prophetic insights is what conditions the existence of the new South Africa. That the new South Africa is only possible if we forget Biko. The fact that Biko lived, that he put his thoughts to paper, the fact of Biko's life and thought is a reminder, always a reminder, that different historical possibilities had in fact been enunciated and were available for the making of a new South Africa. But to illustrate this, it is necessary to briefly recapitulate Biko's proposition concerning the proper interpretation of the historical situation and social reality in South Africa at that time. Biko recognized that to use his words, the fundamental disorder in South African society was, and we might say is, that while blacks numerically and statistically outnumbered whites, they were subjugated by a white minority government and were subjected to the most extreme forms of social, political, economic, and cultural domination, which for the most part subsumed black people's lived experience. Now, Biko's analysis of the sources of this disorder differed radically from what we might call the dominant doxa or the dominant assumptions of the times. The dominant doxa of the times saw the problem of South Africa as the problem of apartheid, the specific juridical formation of apartheid and its operative pillars of authoritarianism, discrimination, segregation, disenfranchisement, and deprivation. On the logic of this doxa, the remedy to correct the injustices of apartheid would of course be non-racial universal suffrage, liberal democracy, constitutional supremacy, and human rights, because these would presumably depart from the legal and political culture of apartheid and facilitate the incorporation of blacks as equal citizens into the South African polity. This doxa, this assumption, was premised on the view that the racial exclusion of blacks in South Africa should, not only could, but should be corrected through integration, through what Frantz Fanon called being nice to the niggers. And it is this doxa that ultimately framed the negotiations as well as the transitional justice and constitution-making process in South Africa. In contrast, however, Biko traces the problem frequently to the famous date 1652, which signifies that according to his understanding, South Africa is a settler colony that at least since the mid-17th century has been organized in terms of, this is a signal concept in Biko's writing, the totality of white power. In this situation, it is what Biko called the color problem, that is race, and not say class or totalitarianism, that was the source of the fundamental problematic of South Africa. To end the colonial order in South Africa and to achieve a liberated society, says Biko, the thesis, which is white supremacy, and the antithesis, that is black consciousness, have to come into dialectical conflict, which is the dominant language of the times. Without such a conflict, the thesis, that is white supremacy, would remain the organizing principle of society, which for our purposes means that a new constitution emerging from compromise and negotiation, as opposed to this dialectical confrontation, cannot result in a synthetic and hence a revolutionary reconstitution of South Africa. Such a constitution can, in other words, only result in a reconfiguration of the thesis and thus a continuation of white supremacy. Interestingly, Biko articulates a conception of change that is not a mere inversion in power relation, so it's not a mere turning of the tables, but it also does not amount to acceding to white power and seeking a place at the white man's table. So it's neither turning the tables nor seeking a place at the white man's tables. Instead, Biko writes, we knew, he says of the white man, in like capital letters, so all white people, that's we knew he had no right to be there. We wanted to remove him from our table, strip the table of all the trappings put on it by him, decorate it in true African style, settle down, and then, importantly, ask him to join us on our own terms if he liked. So in Biko's formulation, a non-racial society can only come into being through abolishing the racialized markers of being. and precisely not by protecting white racial interests in the name of national unity. The choice to found a new South Africa, and it was a choice, to found a new South Africa on the basis of compromise, reconciliation, and negotiation, paradoxically keeps alive the antagonism that is purportedly being ended, overcome. So even if it's well-meaning, it fails to get rid of the thing it's trying to get rid of, because an essential part of the system has to live on in the new South Africa. This kind of new South Africa, therefore, keeps alive, in other words, to quote Biko, the superior-inferior white-black stratification that makes the white a perpetual teacher and the black a perpetual pupil. And it does not address the problem that Biko also identified, that a settler minority has imposed an entire system of values on an indigenous people. The inordinate focus during the transition to a new constitutional order on only legal and political apartheid, and not on the longer colonial period that was characterized by land dispossession and epistemicide, but also not paying attention to the spatial, the cultural, the epistemological, and the economic apartheids that so crucially defined the racial reality in South Africa. The failure to pay attention to those things is, I think, what has now brought the present South Africa into a conceptual and political crisis. The transition to a new South Africa and the jurisprudence that followed it thus adheres precisely to the model of integration that Biko so presciently and so prophetically warned about. Such a path of change, Biko said, would ultimately be artificial. Here is Biko. The myth of integration, he says, as propounded under the banner of liberal ideology, must be cracked and killed, because it makes people believe that something is being done when in actual fact the artificial integrated circles are soporific on the blacks and provide a vague satisfaction for the guilty stricken whites. Integration, says Biko, works on a false premise, and that false premise is that because it appears difficult to bring people from different races together in South Africa, merely achieving this integration is itself a step towards the liberation of blacks. Nothing, Biko says, could be more irrelevant and therefore misleading. And Biko ends by saying, those who believe in it, those who believe in the idea that you can achieve liberation through integration, are living in a fool's paradise, he says. That's him, not me. Integration for Biko, therefore, is not a workable path for the reconstruction of a society, because it has a built-in Manichaean asymmetrical structure to it, in which there is the integrator, white South Africa, and the integrated, the black majority. In this arrangement, blacks, now marked as previously disadvantaged, are the candidates for integration into the largely white-created polity. And it is whites who set the standard for integration. And one need look no further than the recent events that have been happening in schools around their hair policies to see the dark side of integration. Because integration is itself an expression of domination and inequality that re-articulates the superiority of whites, it cannot result in substantive change across the public and private, cultural and socio-economic, spatial and psychic landscape of South Africa. As Biko explains further, this is his words again, hastily arranged integration cannot be the solution to the problem. It is rather like expecting the slave to work together with the slave master's son to remove all the conditions leading to the former's enslavement. And because the transition was, as we now know, an elite-driven one, this also means that black people did not develop the trajectory of their own struggle, something that Biko saw as a precondition for true social change in South Africa. If one thus reads the present South Africa through Biko's looking glass, it should come as no surprise that the power relations and the governing paradigms produced through colonization and apartheid have remained virtually untouched in the post-94 period. Biko, for his part, placed an emphasis on substantive social reconstruction and on a paradigm shift in the governing value systems, social relations, and institutions. He foresaw that black political leadership in an unchanged economic and social structure would have no effect on the hegemony of the historically dominant white group in South Africa. Famously, and this is, I think, Biko's most powerful prophetic moment, He writes that if we have a mere change of face of those in governing positions, what is likely to happen is that black people will continue to be poor, and you will see a few blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie. Our society will be run almost as of yesterday. Our society will be run, says Biko, almost as of yesterday. It is thus an error, if we listen to Biko, to equate the absorption of blacks into already created legal, political, economic, and socio-cultural systems with freedom or justice. It is an even greater error to reduce liberation to the constitutional recognition of socio-economic rights and access to basic services. A process of liberal democratic constitutional change which does not at the same time bring about a reconstitution and restoration of the polity at the level of political economy, at the level of ways of knowing and ways of being, and social relations can only produce an abstract rather than authentic and concrete liberation. This delivery of only an abstract and illusory freedom creates a ruse or a tension in which a formally liberated subject still occupies the position of the underclass in a society. In such a case, the new order, or the new South Africa, marks a re-articulation of black people's unemancipated condition. Post-conflict democratization, in contrast to decolonization, always formulates the content and vision of freedom and justice in limited and limiting ways, not least in part due to the liberal framework in which it operates. This is made worse by the fact that the process of democratization that gave rise to the new dispensation was driven by interests that were not primarily the black majority. It is precisely this conundrum of incomplete liberation or partial freedom that Biko anticipated in his prophetic moments. And so it seems to me that the force and the contemporary relevance of Biko still persists today, because the project and problem of realizing black liberation also still persists today. Biko therefore makes a claim on the present. In his prophetic moments, Biko gestured to the problem of a post-apartheid society that would remain structured by the colonial apartheid status quo. His dream of total liberation, of a new society, of a true humanity, contrasts very sharply, I would say, with the South African concern with individualist schemes and neoliberal schemes such as black economic empowerment, representativity in the workplace, poverty alleviation, and even transformation, which leads to, like, you know, people taking photos of like expensive receipts that they bought alcohol for 30,000 rand, and that's freedom and black excellence and all kinds of bizarre things like that. This is because Biko's project entailed changing the very structure and order of things in a society, and not simply racially democratizing existing white structures and orders. Seeing post-1994 South Africa through the lens of Biko's politics and black consciousness philosophy, therefore, does not paint a very pretty picture. In this picture, we come to understand how a transition from white settler colonial domination based on a model of integration, traveling under the banner of human rights, reconciliation, and democratization, not only leaves much of the colonial apartheid social and economic structure and symbolic order intact, but also results in the reproduction of white racial power on many levels. We see a country which, by reducing freedom and justice to assimilation into white South Africa, that is, the South Africa named, made, and imagined by its European conquerors and their descendants, we see a country which ends up being run almost as of yesterday, as Biko said. Now, when this fact of unfreedom, when this obscene and absurd fact is obscured through the founding of national myths, such as the Rainbow Nation of God and so forth, and the ideological mystifications of the law, the entire process of change seems to have become obscene, as Saidiya Hartman would say, insofar as it must turn a narrative of defeat into an opportunity for celebration. To this extent, contemporary South Africa, when seen through Biko's eyes, is a fool's paradise. Thank you.